So in today's video, we're going to be doing a basic overview of simple genetics in order to try and explain reptile morphs to you guys. But before we get into that, I just want to make a quick announcement to say that I've started a Facebook page. So if you want to follow me over there, the link to that will be in the description. But without wasting any more time, let's get straight into the video. So, the appearance of an organism is actually dictated as a combination of its genetics and its environment, with these factors impacting more heavily on certain traits than others. So, for example, albinism is almost purely dictated by the genetics of an animal, whereas height is dictated by both. So, for example, somebody might have genes that allow them to grow taller than another person, but if somebody eats more food than another, then they can grow taller. The genetic code of an organism, or its genome, is all of its DNA, with DNA being the long, thin molecule made up of two interlocked backbones that form the famous double helix. Now, there are actually several separate strands of DNA that make up an organism's genome as opposed to just one. The way to think of it is like as if a strand of DNA was a book, then the genome of an organism would essentially be a volume of the books. Or another example, if a strand of DNA was to be a DVD, then you could say that the genome was like a box set. A copy of the genome is contained within every single cell of an organism's body, apart from, obviously this being biology, the odd exceptions, for example the red blood cell, and also some other cells that I'll talk about in a second. Within the cells that contain them, DNA strands are actually wrapped around proteins called histones to form long sausage-like structures called chromosomes. Now, these aren't always the X-shaped thing that people think about, and most of the time they're just sort of a spaghetti structure called chromatin, but I'm going to ignore that for now because it's a whole nother topic for another day. Chromosomes actually come in pairs, having partner chromosomes, or homologous chromosomes to use the correct term, and each contain code for the same things, for example, eye colour and hair colour. Now, the code for a specific thing is called a gene, and there are actually several genes that are present on each chromosome. The thing to bear in mind is that although the chromosomes in a homologous pair do have genes for the same thing, these genes aren't going to be exactly the same. So, for example, if we look at the diagram, you can see that I've said that gene A is for eye colour. Well, the specific gene on one of the chromosomes could be for brown eyes, whereas it could be blue on the other. Now, they're both genes for eye colour, but they're not exactly the same, and that is the key point to get across. We call the different specific types of a gene alleles of that gene. And it is the alleles that an organism possesses alongside its environment that will dictate the characteristics it displays. Now, a dominant allele, or morph as we say in the reptile hobby, only needs to be present on one of the two chromosomes containing the relevant genes. So, for example, there might be a pair of chromosomes containing the genes for skin pattern and colour in a royal python, and the normal trait is a dominant allele. So, in those chromosomes that contain the pattern and colour genes, only one of them needs to hold the allele for the normal trait in order for the animal to display characteristics associated with it. Just as a side note, it's actually probably a lot more complicated than this, with several genes actually coming into play at once, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to ignore that. In the case of recessive alleles, an organism must possess the recessive allele on both of its relevant chromosomes in order to display the associated traits. We say that an organism with two copies of the same allele is homozygous for that allele, and therefore, for an organism to display the traits associated with a recessive allele, it must be homozygous for that allele. Conversely, if an organism only has one copy of one type of allele and a different copy of another allele relating to the same gene, then we say that it is heterozygous, or het, for either of the alleles, just depending on what we're using in notation. So, by that understanding, we can say that an animal with a dominant allele, in order to display the traits associated with that allele, it only has to be at least het for the allele, or it can be homozygous, and it will display the associated traits. Right now is where I'm going to mention that there are also other types of alleles, so codominant alleles, incomplete dominant alleles, and there are also some allelic traits, and I'm not going to talk about them in this video because that's a whole different can of worms, and I'm trying to keep this simple and it's already quite complicated. The question that undoubtedly remains is how on earth these traits are passed on to an organism's offspring. The important thing to know is that while most of an organism's cells have paired chromosomes, ignoring those weird ones like the erythrocytes, the gametes, sperm and egg cells, don't. Instead, they only have lone chromosomes, so half the number of chromosomes as the rest of the normal body cells. Any of the alleles carried by a female could be in one of her egg cells, and any of the alleles carried by a male could be in one of his sperm cells, but there's always going to be one allele of each gene type in a gamete, if all things are going normally, of course. To put that in other words, every single gamete must contain a gene for eye colour, but if say we're talking about a sperm cell and the male has the allele for brown eyes and the allele for blue eyes, it's completely random whether the sperm cell ends up with the blue eye allele or the brown eye allele. During fertilization, all of the chromosomes in the sperm cell become part of the same new cell as all of the chromosomes from the egg cell. So the cell created once again has a full set of chromosomes, half of which came from mum and half of which came from dad. This means that if two normal looking animals, but that are heterozygous for a recessive trait, breed together, then if their gametes contain a copy of that recessive allele, then the offspring born can have two copies and therefore display the traits. And that pretty much brings us to the end of this basic summary of genetics. Now, it is by no means the end of genetics, it's just the very start. So if you're more interested and you want to find out more stuff, then I suggest you go and do some more research, because there is lots out there and it's a really interesting topic in my opinion. But either way, that is the end of this video, and I do hope that you found it interesting or informative, and if you'd like to see similar content in the near future, then do hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.